All right, so in the previous video, we discussed a little bit about development environments. And part of that development environment was this thing called Git. And like I said before, Git is a version control system, or what is also often referred to as source code management. So source code management is exactly what it sounds like. It's software services that help us manage our source code. And just like a programmer, our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is just as much a source code as PHP and C++. So it benefits from the same things that other programming languages would benefit from using a source control management software like Git. So Git is kind of the underlying technology that runs the version control that we want to use. The other half of that is an online service called GitHub. And what GitHub does is it does a few things. First and foremost, it is a place for your code. And GitHub allows you to store your repositories on their servers. So it's a really nice backup, and it's a really nice visual place to look at your code. GitHub is a place to share code. GitHub has an enormous repository of open source software. In fact, most of the major open source software distributions and deployments are hosted on GitHub, and this includes Ruby on Rails and almost the entire Rails ecosystem, a huge part of the Python ecosystem. It's a big deal. It's probably the largest code repository on the internet right now. So GitHub is a great place for your code. It's a great place to share your code, and it is just a great networking tool in general. So it allows you to connect with other people in your industry doing similar things and share and collaborate on that code. So it's very, wish I could spell here, ING. So it's very helpful in that regard. So we're going to be using both, but before you can use GitHub, you need to have Git installed on your computer. So let's just briefly recap exactly what Git is doing. So on our computer, once we create a new project, so say we have a new folder called, My Great Website. Okay, so My Great Website, we created it, and inside of that folder, we have an index file and maybe an about.html file. So just those two files. What Git does is it tracks all of this. So when we create a new Git repository inside of this, we'll get a hidden folder called .git. And what this little hidden folder is going to do is it's going to help keep track of all the stuff we do to these files, both creating new files. So if we create a new file here, Git will know about that. And if we make any changes to these files, Git will know about that. And it will make it knows how your project looked before, and it compares it to when you changed it, and it can tell you what's changed, basically. So these changes can then be committed to a repository. And that repository, for the most part, is local on your machine. So every time you commit, all of your code goes into this repository under a particular version number. So we can make a comment here and know exactly what version of our code we have committed. And we can also revert our code back to this version at a later date. So say we get down the line and we realize that we messed something up, or we need to go back, or, I had this great bit of code that I know was there 2 weeks ago. We could jump back to the version 2 weeks ago, pull the information we need, and then go back to our main branch. So Git is a distributed version control system. And what that means is that every time you download someone else's Git repository, so say I put this repo up on the internet and someone else downloads it, they're not only downloading my current file set, but they're also downloading the entire history of my project. So they too can go back through and see the entire timeline, the entire history of my commits. So if each of those are a commit, everyone that gets my source code can go back in time and see that. So that is what makes Git a little bit different from other version control software you might have, other version control software that you might have heard of, like Subversion or what's the other one? Bitbucket, I believe. So those are not, those don't work the same way as Git. So Git is a distributed version control system, and that means that when one person checks out your repository, they're actually getting the whole thing and not just the changes and not just the original code. So that makes this very powerful. It allows you to pull in open source code and make changes and then commit it back up to the main project. There's lots of flexibility you can do when working with teams on code. So that's pretty much how Git works. And Git is primarily used at the command line level. So this is going to be in the terminal on your Mac, and you're primarily going to be interacting with Git via commands. And we're going to show those commands here in a little bit. So GitHub comes into the equation after we've already got this repository created. Once we've created our repository, what we do is we push it to GitHub so that GitHub now has a copy of it. And then once it's in GitHub, you can share that code with other people. And the way we're going to use GitHub in this class is that you guys are going to do all your work locally on your repository, and then you're going to push your changes up to GitHub, and then I'm going to pull them down onto my machine. So anytime I want to grade papers or anytime I need to see what code you guys are working with, all you have to do is commit it, and I can immediately pull it down. So this is going to save us from having to send code and images and huge files via email. We won't have to do that anymore. We're always going to have a good record of what's happening. So that's good for you and that's good for me, so that we always have a record of the code that's going in. And it'll just make things easier on all of us in terms of sharing the code. And because this is an online class, that's going to be very beneficial when I can't necessarily be walking around and helping you guys in class. So Git and GitHub are going to be a huge part of what we're doing here. And in the next video, we're actually going to go off of the whiteboard and into the desktop. And I'm going to show you guys how to set up GitHub, set up a new repository, and get it pushed up to GitHub. And while we're doing that, you'll also get to take a look at my current development environment, which is a browser, text editor, and Git. So that's coming up in the next video.